Every morning at 5:30, before the city fully woke up, Ayaan sat on the edge of his bed staring at the same cracked wall. The paint had peeled over the years, forming shapes he had memorized without realizing it. Some mornings the cracks looked like roads leading somewhere better. Other mornings they looked like cages. Today, they looked like nothing at all. Just proof that time had passed and nothing had changed. The alarm kept buzzing, sharp and unforgiving. His hand hovered over the phone, heavy with hesitation. He already knew what would happen if he pressed snooze. He would drift in and out of sleep, wake up late, rush through the day, and end it with the same dull regret that had followed him for years. Still, the question echoed in his mind, quiet but persistent: what's the point? Once, waking up early had meant something. It had been a symbol of ambition, a promise of productivity. Back then, he believed successful people were made in the early hours of the morning. He had tried to copy them: early alarms, strict schedules, big goals written in bold letters on clean pages. None of it lasted. Motivation always disappeared just when real effort was required. He stood up slowly, his feet touching the cold floor, his body moving more from habit than intention. In the small kitchen, the light flickered as he turned it on. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and unfinished days. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it without tasting it, staring out the window at a street that looked exactly the same as yesterday. His mind replayed a familiar list of failures. The course he bought but never completed. The business idea he talked about for months and never started. The gym he joined with excitement and abandoned with embarrassment. Each memory stacked on top of the other until they felt heavier than the morning itself. People used to ask him what he was working on. Now they didn't ask anymore. Silence had replaced expectations. And somehow, that silence hurt more than criticism ever had. His phone vibrated on the counter, breaking the loop of his thoughts. A message from his younger sister appeared on the screen. It was simple, almost careless: "I believe you'll figure it out." No advice. No reminder. Just belief. Ayaan read it again. Then once more. He didn't feel suddenly inspired. There was no surge of confidence or dramatic shift in his emotions. But something subtle happened. The weight on his chest loosened, just a little. Not enough to make him happy. Enough to make him pause. Why had he failed so many times? He had always blamed circumstances. Lack of support. Bad timing. Limited resources. Sometimes he blamed himself. His laziness, his short attention span, his tendency to give up when things became boring or slow. But standing there, barefoot in the kitchen, another thought crept in, uncomfortable and honest. What if the problem wasn't that he stopped too soon? What if the problem was that he expected too much, too fast? He thought about how he approached change. Every attempt had started with intensity. Big goals. Huge expectations. He wanted transformation immediately. When results didn't appear quickly, disappointment replaced excitement, and quitting felt easier than continuing without validation. He had never stayed long enough to let anything grow. The idea unsettled him because it offered no drama, no shortcut, no instant relief. It suggested that the solution might be painfully ordinary. Repetition. Patience. Showing up even when nothing seemed to be happening. He sat down at the small table and rested his elbows on the surface, looking at his hands. They looked ordinary too. Not the hands of a genius or a failure. Just hands capable of doing something, if guided long enough in one direction. Ayaan thought about time. How quickly days passed, how months disappeared. He realized something frightening: time was moving whether he changed or not. Inaction wasn't neutral. It was a decision he was making every day without calling it one. The thought scared him more than failure ever had. He didn't want another dramatic restart. He didn't want another promise that would collapse under its own weight. For the first time, he considered aiming lower, not in ambition, but in action. What if he didn't try to fix his life? What if he just fixed one small part of one day? The idea felt almost embarrassing in its simplicity. No life overhaul. No announcement. No pressure to succeed. Just a quiet commitment that no one else needed to know about. He looked at the clock. There was time. Not much, but enough. 30 minutes, he thought. Just 30. He chose something he had always wanted to learn but never stuck with. Not because it guaranteed success, but because it genuinely interested him. Something that didn't promise quick rewards, only slow improvement. As he opened his laptop, doubt immediately surfaced. This won't matter. You've tried before. You'll quit again. The voices were familiar, and strangely, less powerful than they used to be. He didn't argue with them. He didn't try to silence them. He simply started anyway. The first few minutes were awkward. His focus drifted. He checked the time twice. Nothing felt impressive. There was no sense of progress, only effort. But when the timer finally rang, he stopped. 30 minutes. Done. No celebration followed. No feeling of victory. But there was something else. A quiet awareness that he had kept a promise, however small. And that was new. As he closed the laptop, Ayaan understood something he had never allowed himself to accept before. Change wasn't failing him. He was abandoning change too early to see what it could become. That morning didn't transform his life. But it changed the way he showed up to it. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No inner voice congratulated him for yesterday's effort. No surge of confidence carried him out of bed. In fact, the alarm felt heavier than before, as if his body was testing him, asking whether yesterday had been a one-time accident or the beginning of something uncomfortable. Ayaan lay still for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling this time instead of the wall. The excitement he once relied on was absent. What remained was a choice, quiet, unglamorous, and slightly annoying. He thought about skipping just this once. After all, nothing bad would happen if he didn't do those 30 minutes today. No one was watching. No deadline would be missed. That was exactly why it mattered. He sat up, slower than yesterday, and went through the same motions. Water. Window. Silence. The routine felt fragile, like it could break if he handled it too roughly. His mind tried to negotiate. Maybe 15 minutes would be enough. Maybe he could start tomorrow properly. Maybe consistency didn't really matter as much as people claimed. He smiled faintly at his own thoughts. He had used these arguments before, and they had always led him back to the same place. When he sat down to work, the resistance was stronger. The task felt boring. Progress felt invisible. Every few minutes, his attention drifted toward distractions that promised instant comfort. He noticed how uncomfortable it was to stay with something that didn't reward him immediately. For the first time, he didn't interpret that discomfort as a sign to stop. He recognized it as part of the process. 30 minutes passed again. Then another day. And another. The days didn't suddenly become easier. Some mornings, he felt restless. Other mornings, he felt numb. There were days when he finished the session feeling like he had learned nothing at all. In the past, those days would have convinced him to quit. Now, he treated them as ordinary. That shift changed everything. He stopped judging each day as a success or failure. He stopped asking whether the effort was worth it. Instead, he focused on one simple question: did I show up? Weeks went by quietly. Life outside those 30 minutes remained messy. Bills still arrived. Problems still existed. His circumstances didn't magically improve. But something inside him was becoming steadier. He noticed it one afternoon while walking home. His steps felt lighter, not because his life had become easier, but because his mind was less chaotic. He wasn't constantly switching directions, constantly doubting himself, constantly restarting. There was one small thing he was doing, and he was doing it regularly. That alone gave his days a sense of structure. He ran into Mr. Rahman again one evening and mentioned his new routine casually, almost dismissively, as if it didn't deserve much attention. Mr. Rahman listened carefully, then nodded. Most people quit right before consistency begins to work, he said. Ayaan thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. There were setbacks, of course. One day, he overslept and missed his 30 minutes. The familiar wave of guilt rose instantly. The old pattern threatened to return. You broke the streak, so what's the point now? For a moment, he believed it. Then he remembered something important. He wasn't building a streak. He was building a habit. Habits weren't fragile glass objects that shattered when dropped once. They were more like muscles. They weakened if ignored, but they didn't disappear overnight. The next day, he returned. That decision, to resume instead of restart, felt more powerful than any perfect run he had imagined before. It taught him that consistency wasn't about never failing. It was about refusing to quit permanently. As months passed, the work itself began to change. Concepts that once confused him started to feel familiar. Tasks that once required intense effort became smoother. Not effortless, but manageable. He could see progress now, not because it had suddenly appeared, but because he had finally stayed long enough to notice it. With progress came confidence, and with confidence came opportunity. Someone noticed his work and asked him to contribute. It wasn't a life-changing offer. It wasn't glamorous. But it was real. Old Ayaan would have hesitated, waiting until he felt ready. This time, he said yes. He realized something surprising. Consistency had prepared him for opportunities he couldn't have predicted. He didn't rise to the level of his motivation, he rose to the level of his habits. There were days when motivation returned unexpectedly, flooding him with energy. There were also days when it vanished completely. The difference now was that his actions no longer depended on how he felt. He had built something stronger than emotion, a routine that carried him forward even when his feelings lagged behind. He began to understand that discipline wasn't punishment. It was self-respect in action. Late one night, after finishing his daily session, Ayaan sat quietly, reflecting on how much had changed without making noise. No one had applauded him. No dramatic before and after moment marked the transformation. Yet his life was undeniably different. The man who once waited for the perfect moment now trusted the process. The man who once chased motivation now valued momentum. He no longer needed to feel inspired to begin. Beginning itself had become the inspiration. He looked around his room and smiled softly. The cracked wall was still there. The world outside was still unpredictable. But inside him, something had stabilized. He finally understood the truth he had been avoiding for years. Consistency doesn't change your life all at once. It changes who you are, slowly, quietly, and permanently. And once you change who you are, your life has no choice but to follow. Time continued to move forward, but now Ayaan moved with it instead of being dragged along. The days blended into weeks, the weeks into months, and somewhere along the way the routine stopped feeling like a task and started feeling like part of who he was. Not because it became easy, but because it became familiar. Familiarity removed fear. He no longer woke up wondering whether he would do the work. He simply woke up knowing that he would. There were mornings when the sky outside was heavy with clouds and evenings when exhaustion pressed down on him like a physical weight. On those days, the temptation to skip his 30 minutes whispered softly, suggesting rest, comfort, postponement. Earlier in his life, those whispers had always won. Now, they were just background noise. He had learned that discomfort didn't mean danger. It simply meant effort. Something subtle but profound happened as he kept showing up. His relationship with time changed. He stopped seeing it as an enemy that stole his chances and started seeing it as an ally that rewarded patience. Every day he worked, he deposited something invisible into the future. He couldn't see the return immediately, but he trusted that it was accumulating. This trust spilled into other areas of his life. He began applying the same approach to small, neglected parts of his routine. Cleaning up after himself instead of letting mess pile up. Reading a few pages instead of promising to read entire books. Listening more carefully instead of preparing responses in his head. None of these changes were dramatic, but together they created a sense of order he had never experienced before. People around him noticed before he did. A colleague mentioned that he seemed more focused. A friend said he was easier to rely on. These comments surprised him, not because they were untrue, but because he hadn't been trying to change how others saw him. He had been changing how he treated his commitments. Reliability, he discovered, was attractive. With reliability came trust, and with trust came responsibility. More tasks were placed in his hands. Some days he felt stretched, unsure if he could handle the growing expectations. But instead of panicking, he returned to the same principle that had carried him this far. One day at a time. One task at a time. Show up. Do the work. Repeat. There were failures along the way. Projects that didn't work out. Decisions that led to dead ends. Criticism that stung more than he expected. But failure no longer felt like a verdict on his identity. It felt like feedback. Something to adjust, not something to escape from. That was new. One evening, after a particularly difficult week, Ayaan felt the old exhaustion creeping back in. The kind that wasn't just physical, but emotional. The kind that made everything feel pointless. He sat on his bed, staring at the floor, and for the first time in a long while, he questioned whether the effort was still worth it. Then he thought about the man he used to be. The man who quit whenever doubt appeared. The man whose life was full of potential but empty of follow-through. He realized that stopping now wouldn't just pause his progress. It would pull him back into a version of himself he no longer recognized. So he did what he had learned to do. He showed up, even while doubting. Especially while doubting. As he worked, the fog in his mind slowly lifted. Not completely, but enough to remind him of something important. Consistency wasn't about feeling strong all the time. It was about acting with integrity even when strength was absent. The results of his work began to compound. Skills sharpened. Decisions became quicker. Confidence grew quieter but deeper. He didn't feel the need to announce his progress or prove himself. His actions spoke on his behalf. One day, an opportunity appeared that would have terrified him in the past. It required commitment, visibility, and the risk of public failure. Old Ayaan would have found a reason to delay, to wait until conditions were perfect. This time, he accepted without overthinking. He wasn't fearless. He was prepared. As he stepped into this new challenge, he noticed something surprising. The fear didn't paralyze him. It focused him. Because he trusted his ability to do one thing consistently, he trusted himself to handle whatever came next. Late at night, after long days filled with effort and learning, Ayaan often reflected on how quiet the transformation had been. There was no single moment he could point to and say, "This is when everything changed." Instead, change had arrived in small, almost invisible steps. He finally understood why most people underestimate consistency. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It works in silence, reshaping your habits, your identity, and eventually, your destiny. Looking back, he realized that the real miracle wasn't success. It was endurance. He had learned how to stay. And in staying, he had found everything he once searched for in quitting. Life began to feel less like a series of emergencies and more like a long road with direction. Ayaan no longer rushed from one reaction to another. He moved with intention, even on days when uncertainty lingered in the background. The sense of panic that once accompanied every challenge had softened into awareness. Problems still existed, but they no longer felt personal, as if the universe were testing him specifically. They felt neutral, solvable, and temporary. He noticed how his inner dialogue had changed. Where there had once been harsh accusations, there was now calm evaluation. Instead of telling himself he was failing, he asked what could be improved. Instead of assuming the worst, he allowed room for progress. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was the result of showing up so many times that his mind learned to trust him. Trust in oneself, he discovered, was built the same way trust with others was built. Through consistency. There were days when his routine felt heavy again. Not because it was difficult, but because repetition can be tiring even when it's meaningful. On those days, he reminded himself that boredom was not a warning sign. It was proof that he had moved past novelty. Most people quit at boredom, mistaking it for lack of purpose. He stayed. Staying gave him clarity. With clarity came better choices. He became more selective about where he spent his energy. He stopped saying yes to things that pulled him away from what mattered. Not out of arrogance, but out of respect for the life he was building quietly, day by day. Time, once wasted without guilt, became valuable. Not precious in a stressful way, but meaningful. He began to see patterns in others as well. Friends who complained constantly but changed nothing. Talented people who waited for recognition before effort. Smart people who knew everything except how to persist. He didn't judge them. He recognized himself in them. The difference now was simple. He didn't just understand the value of consistency. He lived it. One afternoon, he found himself in a conversation with someone who asked for advice. The question surprised him. He wasn't the kind of person people used to seek guidance from. As he listened, he realized he didn't have a clever answer or a motivational speech to offer. What he had was experience. Pick something small, he said. Do it every day. Even when it feels useless. Especially then. The words felt ordinary as he spoke them, but he knew how much truth they carried. Challenges grew as his responsibilities grew. Consistency didn't shield him from pressure, it prepared him for it. He faced moments where the margin for error was thin, where his actions affected others, not just himself. That responsibility was heavy, but it was also grounding. It reminded him that his effort mattered beyond his own life. There were moments of doubt, of course. Success didn't erase insecurity. It changed its shape. Instead of doubting whether he could begin, he sometimes doubted whether he could sustain. In those moments, he returned to the same principle that had carried him from the beginning. Today mattered. Tomorrow would be handled when it arrived. He stopped chasing balance and started building rhythm. His health improved quietly. Better sleep. More energy. Fewer anxious thoughts racing through his mind at night. Not because life became easier, but because he had become steadier. He no longer needed constant reassurance from outcomes. The process itself gave him peace. One evening, he visited his sister. As they sat together, she looked at him and smiled. "You seem different," she said. He laughed softly. "I am," he replied. "But not in the way people think." He wanted to tell her that the difference wasn't success or confidence or even happiness. The difference was reliability. He could count on himself now. And that changed everything. Walking home later, he thought about how many times he had waited for life to feel perfect before acting. How many chances he had delayed because he didn't feel ready. He understood now that readiness was not a feeling. It was a result. The road ahead was still long. There would be setbacks he couldn't predict, losses he couldn't avoid, moments when consistency would feel exhausting again. But he wasn't afraid of those moments anymore. He knew what to do when they arrived. Show up. Do the work. Repeat. That simple formula had given him something he had never had before. A future he trusted. Years had passed since Ayaan first decided to commit to 30 minutes a day, and life had shifted in ways he never could have imagined. Not because luck had smiled on him, nor because some sudden opportunity had changed everything overnight, but because he had built himself into someone capable of sustaining effort, facing challenges, and trusting the slow accumulation of small actions. He had become reliable in the way that matters most, reliable to himself. People noticed it, of course. They noticed his calm confidence, his ability to remain steady under pressure, his skill at completing projects without fuss or drama. They didn't see the hundreds of small choices behind each success, the days when he did the work despite feeling exhausted, uninspired, or afraid. They only saw the result, the quiet competence that comes from consistent action. Ayaan often reflected on the journey. He remembered the old version of himself, the man who had tried everything in bursts of sudden motivation, who had quit whenever progress didn't appear immediately, who had measured life in dramatic wins and losses. That man seemed distant now, almost like a stranger. He realized that the real transformation hadn't come from achieving goals, it had come from becoming someone who could achieve them reliably. With this reliability came a new sense of freedom. He no longer felt controlled by emotions, circumstances, or the judgment of others. Fear no longer dictated his actions. He didn't wait for inspiration or perfect conditions. He simply acted, day after day, and trusted the process. Even failure became a tool, not a threat. Each setback taught him something small but invaluable, adding layers to his resilience. Opportunities came in ways he hadn't anticipated. Offers to lead projects, invitations to collaborate, moments where his skill and preparation allowed him to step in while others hesitated. He noticed that consistency wasn't just about personal improvement, it attracted situations and people who valued dependability. Life began to respond to the person he had become, not the person he wished to be. He understood now that most people underestimate the quiet power of showing up. They look for dramatic change, for sudden breakthroughs, for instant results. Few realize that transformation is often silent, almost invisible. It builds in small, repetitive actions until one day you wake up and notice that everything has shifted. Habits compound. Skills accumulate. Confidence grows. Circumstances follow, slowly but inevitably. Ayaan also noticed the subtle changes in his character. Patience had replaced impulsiveness. Discipline had replaced procrastination. He could endure discomfort without giving up. He could start again after failure without seeing it as proof of inadequacy. The ability to persist, to continue even when results were invisible, had become a defining part of who he was. He often shared this understanding with others, not as advice, but as experience. When someone asked him how he managed to achieve what he did, he would smile and say simply, "I just show up every day. That's all. It isn't flashy, and it isn't fast, but it works." He noticed that this simple principle resonated more deeply than any complex strategy or motivational speech. People understood that they didn't need talent or luck to start, they just needed persistence. Life still presented challenges. Unexpected setbacks, moments of doubt, and periods of exhaustion arrived without warning. But Ayaan no longer feared them. He had learned that consistency doesn't remove difficulty, it equips you to handle it. One day at a time, one effort at a time, he faced challenges with a steadiness that would have been impossible in his old life. He found joy in the small victories. completing a task he once avoided. Improving incrementally at a skill he had struggled with. Seeing the direct result of repeated effort in tangible progress. These moments weren't dramatic, but they were profoundly satisfying. They reminded him that growth isn't always visible to others, but it is always real. Ayaan also began to notice the ripple effect of his